The morning of the winter ball arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed almost mocking in its gentleness. Lady Emmeline Lockridge stood at her bedroom window, watching the groundskeepers prepare the estate's gardens for the evening's festivities, and felt nothing of the excitement that had once made her heart race at the prospect of such an occasion. 5 years had passed since she had felt truly alive at one of these gatherings. 5 years since she had danced until dawn with stars in her eyes and hope blooming wild in her chest. Now, at 26, she had perfected the art of seeming present while remaining carefully detached, of smiling warmly while feeling very little at all. Her maid Catherine bustled into the room carrying the gown that had been delivered from the modiste just yesterday. It was a creation of deep sapphire silk that seemed to capture and hold light like water, with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice that caught the morning sun streaming through the windows. Emmeline turned from her contemplation of the grounds and offered a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's beautiful, Catherine," she said, and meant it, though beauty had ceased to move her the way it once had. Everything had ceased to move her the way it once had, if she were being honest with herself, which she tried very hard not to be on most days. "You'll be the finest lady there, Miss Emmeline," Catherine declared with the fierce loyalty she had shown since Emmeline was a girl in pigtails. "That shade brings out your eyes something wonderful." Emmeline's eyes were grey, the colour of winter skies before snow, and she had been told more than once that they were her finest feature. She had also been told, in a voice that still haunted her dreams, that they held entire storms within them, worlds of feeling that a man could lose himself in forever. But that voice belonged to a memory she had worked very hard to bury, and she would not resurrect it now, not on this day when she needed all her composure. The Lockridge Winter Ball was a tradition that stretched back 4 generations, a glittering affair that marked the heart of the social season and drew the finest families from across England. Emmeline's mother had died when she was 18, leaving her to serve as hostess alongside her father, the Earl of Lockridge, a responsibility she had shouldered with grace even when her heart had been shattered beyond recognition. This year would be no different from the last 4. She would greet guests with practiced warmth, ensure the musicians had refreshments, make certain that wallflowers found partners, and retire to her room at evening's end feeling nothing but a vague exhaustion that had become her constant companion. What Emmeline did not know, what she could not have known as she prepared for what she believed would be simply another obligation fulfilled, was that the list of acceptances that had arrived over the past fortnight contained one name that would change everything. Her father's secretary had handled the responses as he always did, marking them dutifully in the leather-bound ledger kept specifically for this purpose. If she had seen that ledger, if she had run her finger down the column of names, she would have found it there, written in a bold hand that even transcribed into another's script seemed to carry a particular weight. Evander Blackwood, Duke of Ashmore. But she did not see it, and so she dressed with care but without anticipation, fastening pearl drops to her ears and allowing Catherine to arrange her dark hair in an elegant style that left soft tendrils framing her face. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who had learned to present a flawless exterior to the world, who had mastered the art of surface perfection while keeping her true self locked away where it could not be damaged again. By late afternoon, the house had transformed into something magical. Every candle had been lit, every surface polished to gleaming, every flower arranged with artistic precision. The ballroom, with its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers, glowed like something from a fairy tale, and the musicians were already warming their instruments in the gallery above. Emmeline descended the main staircase as the first guests began to arrive, her face arranged in an expression of gracious welcome that came as naturally to her now as breathing. The evening unfolded as such evenings always did. There were the Pembrokes with their 3 unmarried daughters, each more desperately cheerful than the last. There were the Hendersons, whose son had been making awkward overtures in Emmeline's direction for the past year, as if she might suddenly wake from whatever spell held her and recognize him as her destined match. There were distant cousins and close friends, aging dowagers and eager debutantes, gentlemen who had made fortunes in trade, mixing with those whose titles stretched back to the conquest. Emmeline greeted them all with the same measured warmth, her performance so practiced that she barely had to think about it anymore. She danced when asked, conversed when approached, and moved through the glittering crowd with the grace of someone who had been trained from birth for exactly this role. And if there was something hollow at the center of all this motion and beauty, well, no one seemed to notice, and that was precisely how she wanted it. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the ballroom doors opened once more, and the butler announced in his sonorous voice that carried across the music and chatter, "His Grace the Duke of Ashmore." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, suspended in time, and Emmeline felt something shift in her chest, some long-dormant instinct stirring to terrible life. The conversation around her didn't stop entirely, but it softened, people turning with the casual curiosity that always attended the arrival of someone of significant rank. But Emmeline couldn't turn. For a heartbeat, she stood frozen, her fingers gripping her fan with sufficient force to make the delicate ivory sticks creak in protest. It couldn't be. He wouldn't. Not here, not after 5 years of careful distance, of moving in circles that never quite intersected, of the tacit agreement that seemed to exist between them to remain strangers, sharing only a past that neither acknowledged. She had heard, of course, through the intricate network of gossip that connected every drawing room in England, that he had been abroad for much of the intervening years. Italy, someone had said, Greece, places where the sun shone hot and bright and burned away the memory of English winters. She had told herself she didn't care, told herself so often and so firmly that she had almost believed it. But now her body was betraying her with its response, her pulse quickening, her breath catching, every nerve suddenly, terribly alive in a way they hadn't been since the last time she had seen him, since the last devastating words had been spoken between them in the gardens of Ashmore House, words that had ended everything before it had truly begun. She turned slowly, inevitably, drawn by something that felt like fate and tasted like disaster. And there he was. Evander Blackwood stood in the entrance to the ballroom, and 5 years had changed him in ways that stole what little breath she had remaining. He had been handsome before, with the kind of classical features that made painters reach for their brushes, but there had been a softness to him then, a youth that had not yet been refined by experience. That softness was gone now. The man standing before her was harder somehow, leaner, with a presence that seemed to command the space around him without effort. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, touched with silver at the temples that hadn't been there before. His face, that face she had once traced with trembling fingers in the moonlight, was more angular now, lines of experience carved around his mouth and eyes that spoke of years she knew nothing about. But it was his eyes that undid her completely. Those eyes, grey-green like a stormy sea, found hers across the crowded ballroom with unerring accuracy, as if he had known exactly where she would be, as if some invisible thread still connected them despite all the distance and silence and carefully maintained separation. And in those eyes she saw everything she had been trying to forget, the passion they had shared, the terrible argument that had torn them apart, the weight of 5 years spent apart when they might have been together, if only they had been braver, wiser, less consumed by pride and fear. The moment stretched between them like spun glass, fragile and sharp, while the ballroom continued its oblivious celebration around them. Emmeline felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack, felt the feelings she had buried so deep begin to claw their way toward the surface, and she knew with sudden, absolute certainty that this night would not be like all the others. This night, the past she had been running from had finally caught up with her, and there would be no escape. Evander began to move through the crowd toward her, and she watched him come with a sense of inevitability that was almost peaceful in its finality. She had spent 5 years building walls around her heart, 5 years convincing herself she had moved beyond what they had shared, 5 years lying to herself with increasing success. But all those lies crumbled like sand as he drew closer, and she was left standing exposed and defenseless, facing the one person in all the world who had ever truly seen her, truly known her, and whom she had driven away with words she had regretted every day since. He stopped before her, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of bergamot and something else, something that was uniquely him, a scent that brought memories flooding back with painful vividness. His bow was perfect, exactly what propriety demanded, but there was something in the way he held himself that suggested barely leashed intensity, as if he were a wild thing dressed in civilized clothing, playing at manners while feeling something far more primitive beneath. "Lady Ameline," he said, and his voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by time and perhaps by other things she couldn't name. "You look well." Such simple words, such inadequate words, to mark a reunion 5 years in the making. She should say something equally banal, should match his surface politeness with her own, should treat him as she would any other guest at her father's ball. Instead, she found herself saying, "You came." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, and it was painful to see because she recognized it, recognized the way his mouth curved and the way his eyes warmed slightly, even as they remained watchful. "I was invited." "I didn't know." The words escaped before she could stop them, a confession she hadn't meant to make. "I didn't know you would be here." "Would you have hidden if you had known?" he asked softly, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a kind of weary curiosity, as if he genuinely wanted to know the answer but was prepared for it to hurt him. The honest answer was yes. She probably would have claimed a headache and retreated to her rooms, would have sent her father to make her apologies, and spent the evening listening to the music drift up from below while she told herself she was being sensible and self-protective. But she couldn't say that, not with him standing before her radiating an intensity that made her feel more alive than she had in years. So instead she simply said, "I don't know." Around them the ball continued, but Ameline was aware that they were beginning to attract attention, that several heads had turned in their direction with the predatory interest of those who sensed potential scandal. She should move away, should circulate among her other guests, should treat him with no more and no less attention than anyone else in attendance. But her feet seemed rooted to the floor, and she couldn't make herself leave, couldn't make herself end this moment even though she knew it was dangerous, knew that every second she stood here was a second longer she allowed him back into her carefully ordered life. "Dance with me," Evander said, and it wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a command, but something in between, something that spoke of desperation, barely held in check. "I don't think that's wise," she managed, though her voice sounded faint even to her own ears. "I don't care about wisdom," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that stripped away the veneer of civility he had been maintaining. "I have been wise for 5 years, Ameline. I have been sensible and rational and have done all the things I was supposed to do. I have given you the distance you demanded, have lived with the choices we made, have tried to forget what we had. And I can't do it anymore, so please, just one dance, grant me that much." She should refuse. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to refuse, to protect herself from the inevitable pain that would come from allowing him back in, even for the space of a single waltz. But she had spent 5 years being sensible, 5 years protecting herself so thoroughly that she had forgotten what it felt like to feel anything real. And standing before him now, seeing the naked plea in his eyes, hearing the rawness in his voice, she found that her defenses were paper-thin after all, that they had never really been strong enough to keep him out, only strong enough to keep her lonely. "One dance," she heard herself say, and watched something like relief flash across his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it if she didn't know him so well, if she didn't still carry the memory of every expression he had ever worn imprinted on her heart. He offered his hand and she took it, and the moment their fingers touched, she felt it like an electric shock, a jolt of recognition that traveled up her arm and lodged itself somewhere near her heart. His hand was warm and strong and familiar despite the years, and she remembered with sudden, painful clarity the last time he had held her hand, the last time she had felt his skin against hers. It had been in the gardens at Ashmore House, at a ball not unlike this one, and he had been pleading with her to give them a chance, to choose love over duty, to trust that what they felt was worth fighting for. And she had refused, had told him with all the certainty of youth that they were being foolish, that passion was not enough, that she wouldn't risk her reputation and her family's standing for something that might burn out as quickly as it had ignited. She had been so sure she was right, so convinced that she was being mature and realistic, and she had spent every day since wondering if she had made the biggest mistake of her life. He led her onto the dance floor as a waltz began, the musicians seeming to sense the significance of the moment, even though they couldn't possibly understand what was transpiring between them. His hand settled at her waist, and she placed hers on his shoulder, and they began to move together with an ease that should have been impossible, after so long apart, but instead felt as natural as breathing. Her body remembered his, remembered the way they fit together, the way they had always moved as if they were two parts of a single whole. "You've been well?" he asked as they swept across the floor, his voice carefully neutral, as if they were strangers making polite conversation, and not two people whose history was written in heartbreak and regret. "Well enough," she replied, matching his tone. "And you? I heard you traveled." "I did. Italy mostly, Greece for a time. I thought perhaps if I put enough distance between myself and England, I might manage to forget." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, become more intimate despite the crowd surrounding them. It didn't work. She stumbled slightly, and his hand tightened at her waist, steadying her, and the concern in his eyes was so familiar, it made her throat tight with unshed tears. "Evander." "I know," he said quickly. "I know we can't speak of such things here. I know this is neither the time nor the place, but Ameline, I need you to know that I came here tonight with a purpose. I came because I couldn't stay away any longer, because 5 years of trying to forget has only proven to me beyond any doubt that I never will. I came because I need to know if you feel it too, this thing between us that never died, or if I am alone in this torture." "You're not alone," she whispered before she could stop herself, the admission tearing itself from somewhere deep inside, from a place she had locked away but never managed to fully silence. "God help me, you're not alone." His hand tightened convulsively on hers, and she saw something flash in his eyes, something fierce and possessive that should have frightened her, but instead sent heat coursing through her veins. "Then give me a chance," he said urgently, his voice barely audible above the music. "Give us a chance. Not here, not now, but soon. Meet with me. Talk with me. Let me prove to you that what we had was real, that it was worth fighting for then, and is still worth fighting for now." The waltz was ending, the final notes hanging in the air like a question waiting to be answered. In a moment they would have to separate, would have to return to their roles as hostess and guest, would have to pretend that everything was as it had been before he arrived. But nothing was as it had been, and they both knew it. The careful peace Ameline had constructed for herself was shattered beyond repair, and she stood at a crossroads she had thought she would never face again, forced to choose between the safety of her solitude and the terrifying possibility of opening her heart to someone who had already proven he could destroy it. She looked up at him, into those eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years, and saw in them such hope and desperation and raw, unguarded love that it made her breath catch. And she realized in that moment of crystalline clarity that she had never really had a choice at all. She could no more deny what was between them than she could deny her own heartbeat. She could continue to run, could continue to hide, but she would only be delaying the inevitable. Evander Blackwood was her past, yes, but he might also be her future, if she could find the courage to reach for it. "The rose garden," she heard herself say as they separated, his hand lingering in hers for just a moment longer than propriety allowed. "Tomorrow at 4. We can talk there without being observed." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night, and it made him look suddenly younger, more like the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "I'll be there," he promised. And then he was bowing over her hand, his lips brushing her knuckles in a gesture that seemed to burn through her gloves, and she was watching him walk away, back into the crowd, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the dance floor with her heart pounding and her mind reeling, and the certain knowledge that she had just set something in motion that would change everything. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Ameline moved through the remaining hours of the ball in a daze, dancing when asked, conversing when approached, but aware that some fundamental shift had occurred within her, as if a dam she had been maintaining with constant vigilance had finally cracked and was now leaking emotions she had kept contained for years. She was aware of Evander throughout the night, could sense his presence even when she couldn't see him, as if some part of her was attuned to him on a level that transcended normal perception. She saw him dance with other ladies, saw him charm her father's friends, saw him move through her ballroom with an ease that suggested he belonged there, belonged in her life in a way that felt both right and terrifying. And more than once she felt his eyes on her, felt the weight of his gaze across the room, and when she allowed herself to look back at him, she saw in his face a determination that both thrilled and frightened her. By the time the last guests departed and the musicians packed away their instruments, Ameline was exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical tiredness. She climbed the stairs to her room, feeling as if she were walking through deep water, every movement requiring effort she could barely muster. Catherine helped her out of the sapphire gown and into her nightdress, chattering about the success of the evening, about which gentleman had seemed particularly attentive, about Lady Pembroke's unfortunate choice of feathers. Ameline responded with automatic murmurs, but her mind was elsewhere, already in the rose garden, already facing a conversation she had no idea how to navigate. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, watching shadows cast by the dying fire dance across the plaster, and tried to make sense of the tangle of emotions churning within her. Fear was there, certainly, the fear of being hurt again, of opening herself to someone who had the power to devastate her. But there was also hope, fragile and tentative but undeniably present, the hope that perhaps they had both learned something in their years apart, had both grown enough to make different choices than they had made before. And underneath it all, stronger than either fear or hope, was the simple, undeniable truth that she loved him. She had loved him 5 years ago, and she loved him still, and all the distance and time in the world hadn't changed that fundamental reality. She had tried to bury that love, had tried to convince herself it was merely the passionate infatuation of youth, something she had been right to dismiss. But seeing him tonight, feeling her entire being come alive at his presence, she could no longer maintain that fiction. What she felt for Evander Blackwood was as real and vital now as it had been then, perhaps more so because it had survived every attempt to kill it. The question was what she would do with that knowledge. Would she have the courage to reach for what she wanted, even knowing it might end in heartbreak? Or would she choose safety over passion, protection over possibility? Tomorrow in the rose garden, she would have to decide, and the weight of that impending choice pressed down on her, until sleep finally claimed her in the hours before dawn. She woke to grey skies and the promise of rain, weather that seemed to mirror her own internal turbulence. The morning dragged with excruciating slowness, every hour feeling like 3, every minute weighted with anticipation and dread in equal measure. She tried to occupy herself with correspondence, with overseeing the post-ball cleanup, with a dozen small tasks that required her attention, but her mind refused to focus on anything but the approaching appointment in the garden. By 3:30, she could bear the waiting no longer. She threw a shawl over her simple day dress and made her way to the rose garden, arriving early despite her best intentions to appear composed and unhurried. The garden was at the far end of the estate, tucked behind a tall hedge that provided privacy from the house, and in summer it was a riot of color and fragrance. Now, in the late autumn, most of the roses had finished blooming, but a few late flowers still clung to the bushes, petals going brown at the edges, but holding on with stubborn determination. Ameline paced among the paths, her shawl pulled tight against the chill that had crept into the air, and rehearsed in her mind various speeches, various ways of explaining herself, of protecting herself, of maintaining some degree of control over a situation that felt increasingly uncontrollable. But every imagined conversation dissolved into incoherence as she actually tried to form the words, and eventually she gave up and simply waited, listening to the wind rustle through the remaining leaves and trying to calm the rapid beating of her heart. He arrived precisely at 4 o'clock, and she was struck again by how he commanded space simply by existing in it, by the way his presence seemed to shift the very air around him. He had dressed simply for this meeting, eschewing the formal attire of the previous evening for riding clothes that suggested he had come directly from some other activity, though she suspected he had been as unable to focus on normal pursuits as she had been. "You came," he said, echoing her words from the night before, and there was relief in his voice, as if he had genuinely feared she might change her mind. "I said I would," she replied, and was pleased to hear that her voice was steady, betraying none of the chaos she felt within. They stood facing each other across a narrow gravel path, and for a long moment neither spoke, both seeming uncertain of how to begin a conversation that needed to cover 5 years of silence and pain and carefully avoided truths. Finally, Evander took a step closer and then another, until only a few feet separated them, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the shadows beneath them that spoke of poor sleep, the tension in his jaw that suggested he was holding himself under tight control. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said formally, as if they were conducting business rather than laying bare their souls. "I know it was not easy for you." "Nothing about this is easy," she said more sharply than she had intended, and saw him flinch slightly at her tone. She softened, remembering that he was not her enemy, that they had both been victims of their own youth and pride and fear. "I'm sorry. That was unkind. I'm not sure what we're doing here, Evander. What we hope to accomplish." "I want to understand," he said, and there was something plaintive in his voice now, something that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "I want to understand what happened between us, why you chose to end things the way you did. I have spent 5 years trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what I did wrong, what I could have done differently. And I need to know, Ameline. I need to hear it from you, the real reason, not the polite excuses you gave me that night in the gardens." She turned away from him, unable to bear the intensity of his gaze while she tried to find the words to explain something she wasn't sure she fully understood herself. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said finally, addressing the bare rose bushes rather than him. "That was the problem in a way. You were perfect, or as close to perfect as a man could be, and what we had together was so intense, so all-consuming, that it terrified me." "I terrified you?" He sounded confused, hurt, and she forced herself to turn back to face him, to give him the honesty he deserved. "Not you. What I felt for you. I was 21 years old, Evander, barely out of the schoolroom, and what I felt when I was with you was so powerful it seemed to obliterate everything else. When you walked into a room, I couldn't think of anything but you. When you touched me, the rest of the world ceased to exist. And everyone could see it, everyone was talking about it, about how Lady Ameline Lockridge had lost her head over the Duke of Ashmore, how I had become one of those foolish women who throws away her dignity for a man. "I never wanted you to throw away your dignity," he protested, but she held up a hand to stop him. I know that now, and I probably knew it then, but I was too frightened to admit it. My mother had died just 3 years earlier, and I had watched my father nearly destroy himself with grief, watched him become a shadow of the man he had been, and I thought, if I let myself love you the way I wanted to, if I gave you that much power over me, what would become of me if I lost you? How could I survive that kind of devastation? "So you chose to devastate both of us instead," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only a kind of weary understanding. "So you chose to end it before it could truly begin, to wound us both rather than risk a greater wound later." "Yes," she whispered, feeling tears sting her eyes for the first time in years. "Yes, that's exactly what I did, and I told myself I was being mature, being realistic, protecting us both from inevitable heartbreak. But the truth is I was just a coward. I was too frightened to take the risk, too scared to trust that what we had might actually last." He closed the remaining distance between them in 2 quick strides and took her hands in his, holding them gently but firmly, as if he thought she might bolt if he didn't anchor her there. "And now?" he asked urgently. "Are you still frightened? Are you still unable to trust?" She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers wrapped around hers, strong and warm, and so achingly familiar, and felt something inside her begin to break open, some shell she had been hiding behind starting to crack. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I'm more frightened now than I was then, because I know exactly what I'm risking, know exactly how much it will hurt if this goes wrong. But Evander, I'm also tired. I'm so tired of being lonely, of going through the motions of life without really living, of feeling nothing but this grey emptiness where my heart used to be. You walked into that ballroom last night, and I felt alive for the first time in 5 years, and as terrifying as that is, it's also the most honest thing I've felt since I sent you away." She saw hope flare in his eyes, saw it mix with caution and determination, and something that looked very much like love, and her breath caught in her throat. "I can't promise you it won't be difficult," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I can't promise we won't hurt each other, or that loving each other will be easy. But I can promise you this, Ameline. I have spent 5 years trying to forget you, trying to move on, trying to convince myself that what we had was just youthful passion that would have burned itself out quickly. And all those 5 years have taught me is that I was wrong. What I felt for you then was real, and what I feel for you now is even more real, because it has survived distance and time and every attempt to kill it." "I feel the same," she whispered, the admission tearing itself from somewhere deep inside. "I have felt the same every day since I sent you away, and I don't know if I can survive losing you again, but I think I might die if I don't at least try to have you." He made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her into his arms with a force that should have frightened her, but instead felt like coming home. She wrapped her arms around him and buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid reality of him, and let herself cry for the first time since the night they had parted, great wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. He held her through it, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort, and she felt 5 years of loneliness and regret pour out of her until she was empty and exhausted and somehow lighter than she had been in longer than she could remember. When the storm of weeping finally passed, she pulled back slightly, wiping at her eyes with shaking hands, suddenly self-conscious about the spectacle she had just made. But when she dared to look up at his face, she saw no judgment there, only tenderness and understanding, and a love so profound it made her want to weep all over again. "I'm sorry," she managed, her voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to fall apart like that." "Don't apologize," he said firmly, using his thumbs to wipe the remaining tears from her cheeks. "Don't ever apologize for being real with me, for letting me see what you're feeling. That's all I ever wanted, Ameline. Not your perfection, not your composure, but your truth. All of it, even the messy parts, especially the messy parts." She laughed wetly, a sound that was half hiccup, and felt something in her chest begin to unknot, some tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. "I don't know how to do this," she confessed. "I don't know how to be vulnerable, how to trust. I've spent so long building walls that I'm not sure I remember how to let anyone in." "Then we'll learn together," he said simply. "We'll take it slowly, one day at a time, one conversation at a time. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Ameline. I'm not asking you to throw caution to the wind and trust me blindly. I'm just asking you to give us a chance to see if what we had 5 years ago has survived, if it can grow into something even stronger now that we're older and hopefully wiser." "And if it doesn't work?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. "If we try and fail, if we hurt each other again?" "Then at least we'll have tried," he said, and there was something fierce in his voice now, something that spoke of hard-won wisdom. "At least we'll know we gave it our best effort, that we didn't let fear make our choices for us. I would rather try and fail than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, Ameline. I've had 5 years of wondering, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the wondering is far worse than any hurt that might come from trying." She stared up at him, at this man who had come back into her life like a storm, who was asking her to take the greatest risk she had ever taken, and felt the last of her resistance crumble. He was right. The wondering had been torture, the not knowing had eaten at her soul, and she couldn't bear another 5 years of the same hollow existence she had been enduring. Better to risk everything than to continue living as a ghost in her own life. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like a vow, like a promise, like a leap off a cliff into unknown waters. "Yes, I'll try. I'll give us a chance." The smile that broke across his face was radiant, transforming him from the careful, controlled man he had been into someone younger, lighter, full of joy that he made no attempt to conceal. He lifted her off her feet and spun her in a circle, laughing with pure delight. And she found herself laughing too, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine in a way nothing had been genuine for years. When he set her down, they were both breathless, standing so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the rapid pulse beating at his throat. The air between them seemed charged somehow, thick with possibility and promise, and when he lowered his head toward hers, she knew what was coming. had been waiting for it without realizing she was waiting, and she met him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of moving too fast, of breaking the fragile accord they had just reached. But gentle quickly gave way to something deeper, more urgent, 5 years of longing and deprivation pouring into that single point of contact. His hands came up to frame her face, holding her as if she were something precious and breakable, and she gripped his coat to keep herself anchored, to keep herself from floating away on the tide of sensation that was threatening to sweep her under. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, she felt dizzy and overwhelmed and more alive than she had thought it was possible to feel. He rested his forehead against hers, his hands still cradling her face, and she could feel him trembling, could see in his eyes that he had been as affected as she was. "I've dreamed of that," he confessed in a rough whisper. "Every night for 5 years, I've dreamed of kissing you again, and reality is so much better than any dream." She wanted to say something equally profound, equally romantic, but words seemed inadequate to express what she was feeling, so instead, she simply pulled him down for another kiss, pouring into it everything she couldn't articulate, letting her actions speak where her voice failed. They stood there in the rose garden as the afternoon faded into evening, holding each other, kissing each other, talking in fragments between the kisses about everything and nothing. He told her about Italy, about standing in front of paintings that masters had created centuries ago and thinking only of how she would have loved them, how he would have wanted to share them with her. She told him about the endless social obligations she had fulfilled while feeling nothing, about the suitors she had politely discouraged because none of them had been him, would never be him. It was fully dark when they finally reluctantly separated, both aware that her absence from the house would eventually be noticed and remarked upon. Evander walked her back to the edge of the formal gardens where the house lights were visible through the trees, and there he stopped, unwilling to risk being seen with her in circumstances that might compromise her reputation. "When can I see you again?" he asked, and there was such naked need in his voice that it made her chest tight. "Tomorrow," she said immediately, without even considering whether it was wise or proper. "Come for tea. I'll tell my father you're calling. Make it all perfectly respectable." He laughed at that, a sound full of rueful humor. "Respectable? Yes, we should probably attempt that, though I confess respectability is the last thing on my mind when I'm with you." She blushed, grateful for the darkness that hid her reaction, and was surprised to discover that she was capable of blushing, that there were still parts of herself she hadn't completely locked away. "Until tomorrow, then," she said, and turned to go before she could do something foolish like refuse to leave at all. "Ameline," he called softly, and she paused, looking back at him. He was half in shadow, but she could see the intensity of his gaze, even in the dim light. "I love you. I loved you 5 years ago. I've loved you every day since, and I'll love you for whatever time we have left in this world. I need you to know that. I need you to understand that this isn't some passing fancy or rekindled infatuation. This is the real thing, the forever thing, and nothing will ever change it." The words hung in the air between them, weighty and profound, and she felt them settle into her heart like stones, finding their resting place at the bottom of a deep pool. "I love you too," she said, and was surprised to discover she was crying again, but this time they were good tears, healing tears. "I think I never stopped, not even when I tried." She left him then, hurrying back to the house with her heart full and her mind racing, already planning what she would say to her father, how she would explain Evander's sudden reappearance in her life. The Earl would have questions, certainly, would remember the broken courtship from 5 years ago, and want assurances that his daughter would not be hurt again, but she would find a way to make him understand, would find the words to explain that some things were worth the risk, that some loves were strong enough to survive anything. The following weeks unfolded like a dream, like something too good to be real, but somehow managing to be real anyway. Evander called the next day as promised, taking tea in the drawing room with Ameline and her father, conducting himself with perfect propriety, while his eyes held promises of all the improper things he wanted to do when they were alone. The Earl was cautious at first, protective of his daughter who he had watched suffer in silence for years, but gradually he softened under Evander's obvious sincerity and the undeniable change in Ameline's demeanor. She was alive again in a way she hadn't been since her mother's death, laughing freely, talking animatedly about things that interested her, displaying a vitality that had been absent so long the Earl had almost forgotten what she was like when truly happy. It was impossible to witness that transformation and not be grateful to the man who had caused it. Impossible not to see that Evander Blackwood genuinely loved his daughter and would move heaven and earth to make her happy. They spent as much time together as propriety allowed, and perhaps a bit more than propriety strictly permitted, though they were careful to maintain the appearances that society demanded. They rode together in the park, attended the same social functions, dined at each other's homes with appropriate chaperones present, but they also stole moments alone when they could, finding each other in gardens and libraries and quiet corners, talking for hours about everything they had thought and felt during their years apart, slowly building the foundation of trust and understanding that had been missing from their first attempt at love. Evander told her about the darkness that had consumed him after their parting, about months of drinking too much and caring too little, about the way he had thrown himself into his duties as Duke, with a grim determination to fill the emptiness inside him with work and responsibility. He told her about the moment he had finally admitted to himself that running wasn't working, that no amount of distance or distraction would make him forget her, and about the decision he had made to return to England and fight for what he wanted, instead of accepting defeat. Ameline, in turn, told him about the careful numbness she had cultivated, about the way she had taught herself to go through the motions of living without actually feeling anything, about the loneliness that had become so constant she had almost stopped noticing it. She told him about the moment she had seen him in the ballroom and felt everything come rushing back, all the emotions she had been repressing exploding into awareness so forcefully she had thought she might drown in them. They learned each other again, or perhaps they learned each other truly for the first time, with the wisdom that came from having made mistakes and survived them. Where their first romance had been all passion and intensity, this one was tempered with patience and understanding, with a willingness to communicate, even when communication was difficult, to be vulnerable, even when vulnerability was frightening. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of doubt, times when old fears resurfaced and threatened to derail everything they were building. Ameline would sometimes retreat into herself, would feel panic rising as she realized how much power she was giving Evander over her happiness, how devastated she would be if she lost him again. And Evander would struggle with his own demons, with the fear that she would wake up one day and decide it had all been a mistake, that she would send him away again, and this time he truly wouldn't survive it. It was during one of these difficult moments, about 6 weeks after their reunion, that everything nearly fell apart. They were in the Lockridge Library, supposedly looking for a book of poetry that Ameline had mentioned wanting to read, but actually just seeking an excuse to be alone together. Evander had pulled her into his arms and was kissing her with the desperate hunger that still sometimes overtook them both when she suddenly froze and pushed him away, her face going pale. "I can't do this," she said, backing away from him until her back hit the bookshelf behind her. "I can't. This is too much, too fast. I'm losing myself again, losing my sense of who I am apart from you." He stared at her, confusion and hurt warring on his face. "What are you talking about? We've been careful. We've taken our time." "Have we?" she interrupted, her voice rising slightly in pitch as panic took hold. "Because it feels like we've picked up exactly where we left off, like we've learned nothing, changed nothing. I'm still the same girl who was so consumed by you that she forgot everything else, and you're still the man who wants all of me, who won't be satisfied with anything less than complete devotion." "That's not fair," he said, and there was anger in his voice now, anger and pain. "I have never asked you to give up who you are. I have never wanted anything from you except your honesty, your presence, your willingness to try. But you're right about one thing. I do want all of you. I want your whole heart, not just the parts you feel safe giving. And if that makes me selfish or demanding, then I'm guilty as charged." "Don't you see?" she cried, tears streaming down her face now. "That's exactly what terrifies me. If I give you all of me and then lose you, there won't be anything left. I'll be completely destroyed, unmade, and I won't be able to survive it." "So what's your alternative?" he asked, and his voice had gone quiet now, dangerously quiet. To hold back, to keep part of yourself locked away so that if I hurt you or leave you or die, you'll have something in reserve. Is that really how you want to live, Ameline? Always protecting yourself, always holding back, never fully committing to anything or anyone? It's better than the alternative, she said stubbornly. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were a lie, knew that the careful half-life she was proposing was exactly what had made her so miserable before. Evander must have seen the doubt in her eyes, because his expression softened slightly, though the hurt was still visible. "I can't force you to trust me," he said quietly. "I can't make you believe that I won't hurt you, won't leave you, won't somehow prove unworthy of the faith you place in me. All I can do is love you with everything I have and hope that someday that will be enough." He turned to leave, and Ameline felt panic of a different kind seize her. The terrible certainty that if she let him walk out that door, she would be making the same mistake she had made 5 years ago, would be choosing fear over love, safety over happiness. "Wait," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Please wait." He paused but didn't turn around, and she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself rigid, as if preparing for another blow. She took a shaky breath and made herself say the words she had been too frightened to speak, the truth she had been running from. "You're right. You're right about all of it. I'm terrified of losing myself in you, but I'm more terrified of losing you. And I've been trying to find some middle ground, some way to have you without risking everything, but there is no middle ground. Love doesn't work that way. It's all or nothing, terrifying and total, and I just have to decide if I'm brave enough to take the leap." He turned slowly to face her, hope warring with caution in his expression. "And are you brave enough?" She thought about the alternative, about returning to the grey existence she had been trapped in, about spending the rest of her life wondering what might have been if only she had been courageous. And she realized that she had already made her choice, had made it the moment she agreed to meet him in the rose garden, had made it every day since when she had chosen to see him, to be with him, to open her heart despite her fears. "I'm going to try to be," she said, crossing the distance between them and taking his hands in hers. "I'm going to try, Evander, even though it terrifies me. Even though I can't promise I won't have moments of panic, won't sometimes retreat or try to protect myself. But I'm asking you to be patient with me, to help me learn how to be vulnerable, how to trust that loving you won't destroy me." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I can be patient," he murmured against her hair. "I can be whatever you need me to be. But Ameline, you have to understand something. Loving me won't destroy you. It might change you, might push you and challenge you and force you to grow in ways that are uncomfortable, but it won't destroy you. If anything, I think it might be what finally makes you whole." She clung to him and let herself believe it, let herself imagine a future where love was not something to be feared, but something to be embraced, where vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't become easy overnight. But standing there in his arms, she felt something inside her begin to shift, some fundamental change in perspective that suggested perhaps he was right. Perhaps she had been looking at everything wrong. From that day forward, something changed between them. The panic attacks didn't disappear entirely, but they became less frequent, less intense, as Ameline slowly learned that opening her heart didn't mean losing herself. She discovered that she could love Evander completely, while still maintaining her own identity, that being vulnerable with him didn't make her weak, but actually made her stronger, more authentic, more fully herself than she had ever been. They talked about marriage, about what their life together would look like, about how to blend their households and their responsibilities into something that worked for them both. Evander made it clear that he had no intention of turning Ameline into a decorative duchess, whose only role was to host parties and produce heirs. He wanted her opinions on estate management, wanted her involved in the charitable work he supported, wanted her to be his partner in every sense of the word. And Ameline discovered that she wanted the same thing, wanted to be challenged and included, and treated as an equal rather than as something precious but ultimately ornamental. The vision of marriage they constructed together was nothing like the traditional aristocratic union she had always assumed was her destiny. It was something richer, more complex, a true partnership built on mutual respect and shared values rather than just on passion and attraction. 3 months after their reunion, on a cold December evening with snow falling softly outside, Evander formally asked the Earl of Lockridge for permission to marry his daughter. The Earl, who had watched their courtship with a mixture of approval and lingering concern, gave his blessing with the caveat that Emmeline must be absolutely certain of her choice, that he would not see her hurt again. That night, Evander came to the drawing room where Emmeline was waiting, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. He didn't waste time with pretty speeches or elaborate presentations. He simply dropped to one knee, took her hand in his and said, "Marry me, Emmeline, not because it's expected or because it's the logical next step, but because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you every single day." The ring he slipped onto her finger was a sapphire, the deep blue of midnight, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the firelight and scattered it into rainbow fragments. It was unusual and beautiful and perfectly her, nothing like the traditional ruby or diamond she might have expected, and the fact that he had chosen something so specifically suited to her taste made her love him even more. "Yes," she said, through tears that were equal parts joy and relief, and the lingering echo of old fears finally laid to rest. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll marry you and love you, and try every day to be worthy of your faith in me." "You're already worthy," he said fiercely, rising to his feet and pulling her into his arms. "You've always been worthy. You just needed to believe it yourself." They set the wedding for early spring, wanting enough time to plan properly, but not so much time that they had to wait any longer than necessary. The intervening months were a whirlwind of activity, of guest lists and flower arrangements and dress fittings, all the minutiae that went into creating a wedding worthy of a duke and an earl's daughter. But beneath all the surface preparations, something deeper was happening. Emmeline was learning, slowly but surely, how to be happy. She was learning that joy was not something to be feared or controlled, but something to be embraced fully. That allowing herself to feel deeply didn't make her weak or foolish, but made her human. She was learning to trust not just Evander, but herself, to believe that she was strong enough to survive whatever life threw at her, that love didn't diminish her, but enhanced her in ways she was only beginning to understand. And Evander was learning too, learning patience and gentleness, learning that loving someone meant sometimes giving them space to work through their fears, rather than trying to force them past those fears through sheer determination. He was learning that Emmeline's caution wasn't a lack of love, but a manifestation of how deeply she felt things, how seriously she took her commitments, and he was learning to value that quality rather than resent it, to see her thoughtfulness as a strength rather than a weakness. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of preparations and celebrations. There was an engagement party at Ashmore House that seemed to draw half of London society. A smaller dinner at Lockridge Hall for close friends and family, countless teas and calls and social obligations that had to be fulfilled. Through it all, Emmeline moved with a grace and confidence that was entirely new, no longer the careful, controlled woman she had been, but someone warmer, more vital, more genuinely present in her own life. People noticed the change and remarked upon it, though few understood its source. They saw the happiness in her eyes, the ease of her smiles, the way she seemed to glow from within, and they attributed it to the normal joy of a woman in love and soon to be married. But it was more than that. What they were seeing was a woman who had finally stopped being afraid of her own heart, who had learned that the risk of love was worth taking, that being vulnerable was not the same as being weak. On the eve of her wedding, Emmeline sat in her room at Lockridge Hall, surrounded by her dearest friends, following the tradition of a last evening as an unmarried woman. They laughed and reminisced, shared advice both serious and ridiculous, drank slightly too much champagne and grew maudlin with sentiment. But when they finally left and Emmeline was alone, she found herself not frightened or nervous, but simply peaceful, filled with a quiet certainty that she was making the right choice. She thought about the girl she had been 5 years ago, so certain she was being mature and responsible when she had sent Evander away, so convinced that she was protecting herself from future pain. That girl had been afraid of so many things, afraid of losing control, afraid of being hurt, afraid of becoming her father after her mother's death, consumed by grief and unable to function. She had thought that by keeping her heart carefully guarded, she could avoid that fate, could live a safe if somewhat colorless existence. But she understood now that safety was an illusion, that there was no way to move through life without risking pain, without opening yourself to the possibility of loss. The only question was whether you would take those risks in service of something meaningful, or whether you would hide away and call your hiding wisdom. And she had spent 5 years hiding, 5 years existing but not truly living, and she would not waste another day of her life that way. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect spring mornings that seemed designed specifically for celebrations. Emmeline woke early, too excited and nervous to sleep despite the late night, and lay in bed watching the sunrise paint her ceiling in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours she would be married, would be the Duchess of Ashmore, would be bound to Evander in the eyes of God and society and law. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with an anticipation so intense it was almost painful. The ceremony was held in the same chapel where her parents had married nearly 30 years earlier, a small stone building on the Lockridge estate that had stood for centuries and would likely stand for centuries more. It was filled to capacity with guests, every pew packed with family and friends who had come to witness this union that had been 5 years in the making. But Emmeline was barely aware of them as she stood at the back of the chapel, her hand resting on her father's arm, waiting for the music to begin. Then the organ swelled, and she was walking down the aisle, and there at the front of the chapel stood Evander, looking at her as if she were the only person in the world, as if nothing else existed but her and him, and this moment they had fought so hard to reach. He was wearing formal morning dress, his dark hair brushed back from his face, and he looked so handsome it made her breath catch. But it was his eyes that held her, those grey-green eyes that had always seen straight through to her soul, and in them she saw love so profound it made her want to weep. The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and solemn promises, of Evander's hand warm and steady in hers, of a gold ring sliding onto her finger to rest beside the sapphire engagement ring. She heard herself speak the vows clearly and firmly, making promises she intended to spend a lifetime keeping, and heard him do the same, his voice rough with emotion as he pledged himself to her before everyone they knew. And then the vicar was pronouncing them married, and Evander was kissing her with a tenderness that belied the passion she could feel thrumming beneath his careful control, and the chapel erupted into applause and cheers. They walked back down the aisle hand in hand, man and wife, Duke and Duchess, two people who had found their way back to each other through years of loneliness and regret and had emerged stronger for the journey. The wedding breakfast was held at Lockridge Hall, a lavish affair with seemingly endless courses and toasts that ranged from the heartfelt to the ribald. Emmeline sat beside Evander at the head table, his hand clasped in hers beneath the cloth, and felt as if she might float away from sheer happiness. This was what she had been afraid of, this overwhelming joy, this sense that her heart might burst from the intensity of what she was feeling. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She welcomed it, embraced it, let it wash over her like a cleansing tide. Later, when the official festivities had wound down and most of the guests had departed, she and Evander stole away to the rose garden where they had reunited all those months ago. The roses were blooming now in the warmth of late spring, their fragrance heavy in the evening air, and everything seemed touched with magic in the golden hour before sunset. "Do you remember the last time we were here?" Evander asked, pulling her close and wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "I remember everything," she said softly, leaning back against him. "I remember being so frightened I could barely breathe, so certain that letting you back in would destroy me. I remember thinking that I had to protect myself at all costs, even if that cost was my own happiness." "And now?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Are you still frightened?" She considered the question seriously, taking stock of her emotions. There was nervousness, certainly, the natural anxiety of facing an unknown future. But the paralyzing fear that had dominated her life for so long was gone, replaced by something that felt remarkably like confidence, like faith in herself and in them and in what they could build together. "No," she said finally, turning in his arms so she could look up at him. "I'm not frightened anymore. Or maybe I am a little. But I'm not letting that fear control me. I'm not letting it keep me from living, from loving, from being fully present in my own life. And that's because of you, Evander. Because you loved me enough to come back, to fight for us, to be patient while I learned how to be brave." "You were always brave," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "You just needed to learn to be brave in a different way. Brave enough to be vulnerable, brave enough to trust, brave enough to believe that you deserve happiness, and that loving someone doesn't diminish you, but makes you more yourself." She kissed him then, putting into that kiss everything she felt, everything she couldn't quite find words to express. Love and gratitude and desire and commitment, all tangled together into something too complex and beautiful to be separated into component parts. He responded with equal intensity, his arms tightening around her, and for a long moment they simply held each other as the sun sank lower and the roses perfumed the air and the world seemed to pause in recognition of something significant unfolding. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Evander smiled down at her with such tenderness it made her chest ache. "Take me home," she said softly. "Take me to our home, to our life, to our future." They left for Ashmore House that evening, departing in a shower of rice and good wishes, beginning the journey to the estate that would now be hers as well as his. As the carriage rolled through the countryside in the deepening twilight, Emmeline leaned against her husband's shoulder, her husband, how strange and wonderful that sounded, and felt a contentment so profound it seemed impossible that she had ever lived without it. Ashmore House was magnificent, a sprawling estate that had been in Evander's family for generations, and when they arrived late that night it was lit up like a beacon, every window glowing with welcome. The servants had lined up to greet them, to meet their new duchess, and Emmeline was touched by the genuine warmth in their faces, the clear affection they had for Evander that they seemed prepared to extend to her by virtue of being his chosen wife. That first night in their shared rooms, with the door finally closed on the world, and the two of them alone at last, Emmeline felt a flutter of nerves that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. Evander seemed to sense her mixture of excitement and anxiety because he didn't rush, didn't demand, but simply took her hand and led her to sit beside him on the settee near the fireplace. "We have all the time in the world," he said gently, brushing a stray curl back from her face. "There's no need to rush anything, no need to force anything. This is our beginning, Emmeline, and we get to decide how it unfolds." She loved him for that, for his patience and his understanding, for the way he always seemed to know what she needed even before she knew it herself. But she also knew that she was tired of holding back, tired of letting caution dictate her choices. She had spent 5 years being careful, and where had it gotten her? Nowhere worth being. No, she was done with careful. She was ready to embrace everything marriage had to offer, every joy and challenge and intimate moment. "I don't want to wait," she said, meeting his eyes directly. "I've waited long enough, we've both waited long enough. I want everything, Evander. I want all of you, and I want to give you all of me. No more holding back, no more protecting myself. Just us, fully present, fully committed, fully alive." The look he gave her was searing in its intensity, and when he kissed her this time, there was no careful restraint, no measured control. There was only passion and love, and the overwhelming rightness of finally being together without barriers, without fears, without anything between them but skin and truth and the promises they had made. They came together with a hunger that had been building for 5 years, with a desperate need to confirm physically what they had already confirmed emotionally, that they belonged to each other, that they were meant for this, that every moment of pain and loneliness had been worth it to arrive at this place. Their wedding night was everything, and more than she had imagined, a revelation of pleasure and intimacy that left her breathless and shaken and more deeply connected to him than she had known it was possible to be to another human being. And afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his fingers trailing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, she felt a peace so complete it was almost transcendent. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes, but not in the way it used to. Now it frightens me in a good way, in a way that makes me want to be better, do better, live more fully so I can be worthy of what you give me." "You've always been worthy," he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "And I love you too, more than words can possibly express. Thank you for taking the risk, for choosing love over fear, for giving us this chance." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and when Ameline woke in the morning to find him still there beside her, she felt none of the panic or regret she had once feared. Instead, she felt only gratitude and joy, and the certain knowledge that she had finally found where she was meant to be. The days that followed established the pattern of their married life, a life that was both remarkably ordinary and extraordinarily wonderful. They woke together, breakfasted together, spent their days managing the estate and seeing to their various responsibilities, and came together again in the evenings to share meals and conversation and the simple pleasure of each other's company. It was domestic and peaceful, and everything Ameline hadn't known she wanted until she had it. But there were also challenges, moments when old patterns of thinking tried to reassert themselves, when Ameline would feel herself starting to retreat into protective distance and would have to consciously choose to stay present, to remain vulnerable. Evander was infinitely patient with these moments, never pushing but always encouraging, always reminding her through word and deed that she was safe with him, that loving him wouldn't destroy her but would only make her stronger. And gradually, imperceptibly, the woman she had been transforming completely into the woman she was becoming. The careful, controlled Lady Ameline, who had hosted her father's ball with practiced detachment, was gone entirely, replaced by someone warmer, more spontaneous, more willing to take risks and make mistakes and live messily. The Duchess of Ashmore laughed easily and loved fiercely, and had opinions about everything from estate management to politics to the proper way to train roses. She threw herself into her new role with an enthusiasm that surprised even her, working alongside Evander to modernize farming techniques on their lands, establishing schools for the tenants' children, supporting local artisans and craftspeople. She discovered that she had a gift for management and organization, that she enjoyed the challenge of complex problems and the satisfaction of practical solutions. And Evander, true to his word, treated her as a full partner in all of it, soliciting her opinions, implementing her suggestions, making it clear to everyone that his Duchess was not merely ornamental, but integral to the running of Ashmore. Seasons passed, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, and with each turning of the year they grew more deeply rooted in their life together. There were trips to London for the social season, visits from friends and family, quiet weeks when it was just the two of them rattling around in their enormous house. Through it all, through every triumph and setback, every joy and sorrow, they remained fundamentally united, two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. In their second year of marriage, Ameline discovered she was expecting their first child, and the news brought a joy so profound it was almost painful. She had wondered sometimes if her fear of loss might extend to children, if she would be too frightened of something happening to them to fully embrace motherhood. But holding Evander's hand as they shared the news with her father, seeing the tears of happiness in both men's eyes, she felt only excitement and gratitude and a fierce protective love for the life growing inside her. "Another thing to be frightened about," she joked to Evander that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "And another thing to be brave about," he replied, kissing her softly. "Another adventure we get to have together. Another way we get to grow and change and discover what we're capable of. And Ameline, I have no doubt that you will be the most wonderful mother, that you will pour into our children all the love and strength and wisdom you've developed through your own struggles." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that her own difficult journey would make her a better parent rather than a more fearful one. And as her pregnancy progressed and she felt the baby move within her, felt the reality of this new person they had created together, she found that she was able to believe it. She was able to trust that the same courage that had allowed her to open her heart to Evander would allow her to open it to their children, that love didn't have to be terrifying, but could be a source of strength and joy. Their daughter was born on a rainy autumn morning, arriving with remarkable speed and a lusty cry that announced her presence to the world. Evander was there for the birth, despite it being highly unconventional, holding Ameline's hand and murmuring encouragement, and when the midwife placed their daughter in Ameline's arms, she looked down into that tiny, scrunched face and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "She's perfect," Evander breathed, his voice thick with emotion as he traced one finger down their daughter's impossibly soft cheek. "She's absolutely perfect." They named her Eleanor, after Ameline's mother, and she became the center of their universe in a way that was both overwhelming and wonderful. Ameline discovered that motherhood came more naturally to her than she had feared, that the protective love she felt for her daughter was fierce but not paralyzing, that she could be vigilant without being consumed by anxiety. Evander was a devoted father, shocking society by actually spending time with his infant daughter, rather than leaving her care entirely to nurses, and the sight of him cradling Eleanor in his strong arms never failed to make Ameline's heart swell with love. As Eleanor grew from infant to toddler, as she took her first steps and spoke her first words, and developed into a small person with her own distinct personality, Ameline reflected often on how far she had come from the frightened woman who had sent Evander away all those years ago. That woman had been so convinced that love was dangerous, that opening yourself to another person was an invitation to devastation. And perhaps it was, in a way. Perhaps by loving Evander and Eleanor as deeply as she did, she was making herself vulnerable to a pain she might not survive if something happened to them. But she had learned something crucial in her years with Evander, something that the younger version of herself had been too frightened to understand. That the vulnerability inherent in love was not a weakness to be avoided, but a strength to be embraced. That being willing to risk pain for the sake of connection was not foolishness, but the very essence of what it meant to be human. That a life lived in careful safety was not really a life at all, but merely an existence, a going through the motions without ever truly engaging with the world. She thought about this particularly on the evening of Eleanor's second birthday, when the house was finally quiet after a day of celebration, and she found herself standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching Evander read their daughter a bedtime story. Eleanor was nestled in his lap, her small hand clutching his much larger one, and she was gazing up at him with absolute trust and adoration as he brought the tale to life with different voices for each character. This, Ameline thought, watching them together. This is what I would have missed if I had let fear win. This perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment. All the moments like it. All the joy and connection and deep, abiding love that fills every corner of my life now. I would have traded all of this for the illusion of safety, would have spent my whole life alone and convinced myself it was wisdom. The thought made her shudder, made her profoundly grateful for Evander's persistence, for his refusal to accept her rejection as final, for his willingness to fight for them when she had been too frightened to fight for herself. And it made her determined that when Eleanor grew old enough to understand, she would share her story with her daughter, would teach her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, that the greatest risks often yielded the greatest rewards. As if sensing her presence, Evander looked up and caught her eye, and the smile he gave her was so full of love and contentment that it made her breath catch. He had aged in the years since their reunion, silver now streaking through his dark hair more prominently, lines deepening around his eyes and mouth. But to her, he was more handsome now than he had been as a young man, because now she could read in his face all the experiences they had shared, all the ways they had grown together, all the love they had built through years of choosing each other every single day. She crossed the room and settled onto the arm of his chair, and Eleanor immediately reached for her, wanting both parents close, and they finished the story together, their voices mingling in the soft lamplight. When Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep, they carried her to her small bed and tucked her in with a tenderness that never grew old, no matter how many times they performed this nightly ritual. In their own rooms later, preparing for bed with the comfortable ease of long familiarity, Evander came up behind Ameline as she sat at her vanity removing her jewelry and wrapped his arms around her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Regret taking the risk, choosing this life with all its vulnerabilities and potential for pain?" She knew he was thinking about the fear that had nearly kept them apart, about the 5 years they had lost to her inability to trust. She turned in his embrace so she could look at him directly, so he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. Every day with you, every moment of this life we've built is worth 1,000 years of safe loneliness. You taught me that, Evander. You taught me that love isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated, that being vulnerable isn't weakness, but the greatest strength of all." He kissed her then, soft and lingering, and she tasted in that kiss the same gratitude and wonder she felt, the same awareness that they had been given a precious gift and had been wise enough not to squander it. They had been given a second chance, and they had seized it with both hands, had built something beautiful from the wreckage of their first attempt, had proven that love could survive mistakes and distance and even the passage of years if it was real and true and worth fighting for. Years continued to pass, measured out in birthdays and seasons, in the growing of gardens and the raising of children, for Eleanor was eventually joined by 2 brothers who filled the house with noise and energy and constant motion. Ameline watched her children grow and marveled at how naturally they embraced life, how they loved without hesitation or fear, how they threw themselves into everything with wholehearted enthusiasm. And she realized that this was her legacy, not just giving them life but teaching them through example how to truly live it. There were difficult times, of course. Life was never without challenges, and even the strongest love could not insulate them from loss or disappointment, or the simple struggles that came with managing an estate and raising children and navigating the complex social world they inhabited. But they faced these challenges together, drawing strength from each other, learning and growing through every difficulty they encountered. When Ameline's father passed away after a long illness, leaving her grief-stricken despite having had time to prepare, it was Evander who held her through the long nights when sorrow threatened to overwhelm her, who understood without being told that she needed both comfort and space, who was simply present in the way only someone who truly knew you could be present. And when Evander dealt with financial troubles caused by bad investments and felt he had failed in his duties as duke and provider, it was Ameline who refused to let him withdraw into himself, who reminded him that they were partners in all things, that his struggles were her struggles and that together they could overcome anything. They learned through these trials that love was not some static thing, not a destination reached but a journey constantly unfolding, requiring effort and attention and the willingness to keep choosing each other even when it would be easier not to. They learned that marriage was not always passionate romance and grand gestures, but was often simple steadiness, showing up day after day, being present in the small moments that actually made up the bulk of a life. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Evander surprised her with a trip back to Italy, to the places he had visited during those lonely years when he had tried to forget her. They stood together in front of paintings he had once viewed alone, and he told her about how he had thought of her constantly, about how every beautiful thing he encountered had felt incomplete because she wasn't there to share it. And she wept, not from sadness but from the poignant awareness of how much they had both suffered in their years apart, and how that suffering had ultimately made them stronger, wiser, more capable of appreciating what they had. "I'm glad you didn't forget me," she said, as they stood in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, surrounded by masterpieces, but focused entirely on each other. "I'm glad you carried me with you even when I had sent you away, because I carried you too, Evander. Every day, every moment, even when I was trying my hardest to move on, you were always there, always part of me." "We wasted so much time," he said, a touch of old regret coloring his voice, but she shook her head firmly. "We didn't waste it. We used it to become the people we needed to be to make this work. The love we have now is deeper and stronger, because we know what it's like to live without it. We appreciate each moment because we remember the emptiness of moments lived alone. Every day we have together is precious because we remember the years we spent apart." He pulled her close, kissing her there in the gallery with the art of centuries looking down on them, and she knew that he understood, that he felt the same gratitude and wonder that she did. They had been given something rare and beautiful, and they would never take it for granted. The years accumulated like pearls on a string, each one precious, each one adding to the richness of their shared story. They watched their children grow into young adults, watched Eleanor develop her mother's thoughtfulness and her father's determination, watched their sons become fine young men who understood both duty and joy. They attended weddings and christenings, said goodbye to old friends and welcomed new ones, adapted to the changing times while holding fast to the values that mattered most. And through it all, through every triumph and tragedy, every mundane Tuesday and special celebration, they remained fundamentally themselves. Two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, who had been brave enough to try again after failing once, who had built a love story that was all the more beautiful because it hadn't been easy. On the evening of the 25th anniversary of their reunion at the Winter Ball, not their wedding anniversary, but the anniversary of that night when Evander had walked into the Lockridge ballroom and changed everything, Emmeline found herself standing once again in the rose garden where they had reconnected. The garden had been expanded and enhanced over the years, was now one of the finest in England, but the original section remained unchanged, a memorial to the beginning of their second chance. Evander found her there, drawn by the same memory that had brought her, and they stood together in the twilight as they had so many years before. But now they were older, marked by time and experience, their bodies bearing the evidence of years lived fully. Emmeline's dark hair was threaded with silver, and lines had formed around her eyes and mouth. Evander's temples were entirely grey now, and his face bore the marks of decades spent outdoors managing their lands. But none of that mattered, because when they looked at each other, they saw not just who they were now, but who they had always been. Two souls meant to find each other, meant to love each other, meant to build a life together despite every obstacle fate had placed in their path. "I would do it all again," Emmeline said softly, taking his hand. "Every moment of pain, every year of loneliness, every fear and doubt and struggle, I would do it all again if it brought me back to this moment, to this garden, to you." "As would I," Evander replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I confess I would prefer to skip the 5 years we spent apart and move directly to the rest of our lives together." She laughed, the sound carrying in the quiet evening air, and leaned into him, drawing comfort and strength from his solid presence, as she had for more than 2 decades. "But then we wouldn't have appreciated it as much," she pointed out. "We wouldn't have known how precious it was, how miraculous that two people could find their way back to each other after everything that tried to keep them apart." "Perhaps," he conceded, wrapping his arms around her. "Or perhaps we would have simply had 25 more years together, and I find it difficult to regret anything that would have given us more time." They stood there in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. And Emmeline thought about the young woman she had been, so frightened of her own feelings, so convinced that protecting herself was more important than living fully. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life, and Emmeline felt only compassion for her, only tenderness for the fear that had driven her choices. But she also felt gratitude to her, because that young woman's decision to take a risk, to meet Evander in this very garden, and give him a chance to explain himself, had led to everything that came after. Every joy, every moment of connection, every day of this life she loved so fiercely, it all traced back to that single moment of courage, that decision to face her fears instead of running from them. "Thank you," she said suddenly, and Evander pulled back slightly to look at her in confusion. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For coming back even when I had hurt you. For being patient while I learned how to be brave. For loving me enough to fight for us when I was too frightened to fight for myself." His expression softened with understanding, and he cupped her face in his hands, his touch still capable of making her heart race after all these years. "You never needed to thank me for loving you," he said. "Loving you has been the great privilege of my life, Emmeline. It has made me better, made me more, given my existence meaning and purpose. If anything, I should be thanking you for taking the risk, for choosing love over fear, for giving us this beautiful life." She kissed him then, there in the garden where they had begun again, and in that kiss she poured everything she felt, love and gratitude and desire and commitment, and the bone-deep certainty that she had made the right choice, that every day with him had been worth whatever it cost her to let him in. As they walked back to the house hand in hand, Ameline reflected on the curious nature of time, how it could seem to pass so slowly in the moment, but look so brief in retrospect. The years since their reunion felt simultaneously like forever, and like no time at all, as if they had always been together and had only just found each other. And she realized that this was what love did. It collapsed time, made every moment infinite, while also making decades feel like heartbeats. She thought about the guests at that long-ago winter ball who had witnessed Evander's arrival, who had watched them dance together with barely concealed curiosity, wondering what would come of this reunion between two people who had once been rumored to be deeply in love. If they could see them now, Ameline thought, if they could witness what that single dance had led to, what would they think? Would they be surprised that it had lasted, that the passion they had shown that night had evolved into something deeper and more enduring? Or would they simply nod in recognition, acknowledging what some part of them must have sensed even then, that what passed between Lady Ameline Lockridge and the Duke of Ashmore was no ordinary attraction, no passing fancy, but something rare and precious, the kind of love that comes along perhaps once in a lifetime if one is very lucky indeed. In their private sitting room that evening, with a fire crackling in the grate and the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed to fill every moment with words, Ameline found herself thinking about all the love stories she had read over the years, all the tales of passion and romance that promised happily ever after. And she realized that those stories always ended at the wedding, as if marriage were an ending rather than a beginning, as if the real work of love didn't start until after the vows had been spoken and the guests had gone home. But she knew better now. She knew that the wedding was just the prologue, that the real story unfolded in the years that followed, in the mundane and magnificent moments that made up a shared life. The real story was in learning to communicate when it would be easier to retreat into silence, in choosing gentleness when anger would be more satisfying, in showing up day after day, even when passion faded into routine. The real story was in growing together rather than growing apart, in remaining curious about each other, even after you thought you knew everything, in continuing to choose love even when it would be easier to choose indifference. And their story, she thought with deep satisfaction, was a good one. Not perfect, perfection was an illusion anyway, but real and honest and full of the kind of love that sustained rather than consumed, that enhanced rather than diminished. They had built something solid, something that could weather any storm, and they had done it by being willing to be vulnerable, to take risks, to believe that the potential for joy was worth the risk of pain. As she sat there watching Evander read by the firelight, his reading glasses perched on his nose, his expression absorbed in whatever book had captured his attention, she felt a wave of love so powerful, it was almost painful. This man, who had refused to let her fear dictate their future, who had loved her through every doubt and moment of weakness, who had proven day after day for more than 20 years that he was worthy of her trust. He was everything, not in the desperate, all-consuming way she had once feared, but in a way that was healthy and whole, a way that made her more herself rather than less. "I love you," she said suddenly, interrupting his reading, needing him to know even though she told him constantly, even though he surely must be tired of hearing it. He looked up with a smile, the kind of smile that still made her stomach flutter, even after all this time. "I love you too," he replied, as if it were the simplest, most obvious truth in the world. And perhaps it was. Perhaps some things were that simple, that fundamental, that true. Later, lying in bed with her head on his chest and his arms wrapped around her, Ameline thought about the young woman who had stood in this same house 25 years ago, preparing for a ball and convinced she had moved past her heartbreak, that she had successfully buried her love for Evander Blackwood so deep it could never resurface. How little that woman had known, how naive she had been to think that love could be killed through sheer force of will, that time and distance could erase something that fundamental. She was grateful to that woman, though, grateful for her stubborn survival, her determination to rebuild her life even when her heart was shattered, because that survival had taught her strength, and that strength had given her the courage to try again when Evander had offered her a second chance. Everything she had learned in those 5 years apart, about herself, about what mattered, about how to keep functioning even when you felt broken inside, had prepared her to appreciate what she had when she finally got it back. And now, as sleep began to claim her, surrounded by warmth and love and the simple peace of being exactly where she belonged, Ameline sent a silent thank you to the universe for Evander's stubborn persistence, for his refusal to accept that their story was over, for his willingness to fight for them when she had given up. And she thanked herself too, thanked the woman she had been for finding the courage to take the risk, to open her carefully guarded heart one more time, to choose possibility over protection, because in the end, that was what it all came down to. The choice to be brave, the choice to trust, the choice to believe that love was worth the risk of pain. And she had made that choice, and it had given her everything, and she would never ever regret it. The story could have ended there, with comfortable middle age and the satisfaction of a life well lived. But life, Ameline had learned, never really ended in neat conclusions, with all questions answered and all conflicts resolved. Life continued, surprising and challenging and rewarding in equal measure, right up until the very last breath. Their children grew and married and gave them grandchildren, small bundles of energy and joy who filled Ashmore House with laughter and chaos in a way that reminded Ameline of her own children's youth. She watched Eleanor become a mother and was struck by how naturally her daughter took to the role, how she loved her children fiercely without being consumed by fear. And she realized that this too was part of her legacy, teaching her children to love bravely, to live fully, to embrace risk as part of the beautiful messiness of being human. They aged together, their bodies betraying them in small ways that accumulated over years, joints that ached in cold weather, hair that thinned and grayed completely, the need for spectacles and afternoon naps. But none of it mattered, because they aged together, supporting each other through each new limitation, finding humor in the indignities of growing old, grateful for every day they had when so many others had far fewer. When Evander fell seriously ill in their 38th year of marriage, Ameline faced for the first time the possibility she had always known existed but had managed to avoid contemplating directly, that she might lose him, that the love that had sustained her for decades might be taken away. The fear that gripped her during those terrible weeks when his fate hung in the balance was worse than anything she had experienced, worse than the loneliness of their years apart, worse than any pain she had known. She sat by his bedside day and night, holding his hand, talking to him even when he was too weak to respond, willing him to fight, to survive, to stay with her. And she made bargains with God and the universe, and anyone who might be listening, promising anything if only Evander could be spared, if only she could have more time with him, if only this wasn't the end. He survived, though it took months for him to fully recover, months during which Ameline never left his side, nursing him with a fierce devotion that surprised the doctors, but didn't surprise anyone who knew them. And when he was finally well enough to sit up properly, to take walks in the garden, to resume something like his normal life, they held each other and wept with relief and gratitude and the bone-deep awareness of how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all be taken away. "I'm not ready," Ameline whispered into his shoulder one night, months after the crisis had passed, but when the fear still haunted her dreams. "I'm not ready to lose you. I will never be ready." "I know," he murmured, stroking her hair with hands that still trembled slightly with residual weakness. "I'm not ready either. But Ameline, whenever it comes, whether tomorrow or 30 years from now, we will have had this. We will have had a love that most people only dream of, a life full of meaning and purpose and joy, and that will have to be enough." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that it would never be enough, that she would never stop wanting more time with him. But she also knew he was right, knew that their time together, however long or short it proved to be, was a gift beyond measure. They had wasted 5 years at the beginning, yes, but they had made the most of every year since, had lived fully and loved deeply, and created something beautiful together. "Promise me something," she said, pulling back to look at him. "Promise me that if I go first, you won't shut yourself away like I did. Promise me you'll keep living, keep engaging with the world, keep being the remarkable man you are." "Only if you promise the same," he countered. "If I go first, I don't want you retreating into that grey existence you had before we reunited. I want you to keep living, keep loving, keep finding joy in whatever time you have left." They promised each other, there in the darkness, made vows about death as serious as the vows they had made about life. And though neither wanted to think about a future without the other, there was something comforting in the promises, in knowing that their love was strong enough to survive even separation, that whoever was left behind would honor the other by continuing to live fully rather than merely existing. Evander's illness and recovery changed something between them, made them even more appreciative of the time they had, even more determined to make every moment count. They took more trips together, visited places they had always meant to see but kept putting off. They spent long hours talking about everything and nothing, revisiting old memories and creating new ones. They made love with a tenderness and urgency that came from understanding how precious and fleeting everything was, and they made plans for their 50th wedding anniversary, a celebration they were both determined to reach, marking half a century of marriage with a renewal of their vows and a party for family and friends. As the date approached and preparations were made, Ameline found herself reflecting on the incredible journey they had traveled together, from that first meeting when they were barely more than children, through their passionate young love and devastating separation, through their reunion and all the years that followed. 50 years. It seemed impossible, and yet also entirely natural, as if no other outcome had ever been possible once they had found their way back to each other. 50 years of waking up beside him, of knowing his face better than her own, of growing and changing together while remaining fundamentally themselves. 50 years of being loved completely, of being known deeply, of being chosen again and again despite all the small annoyances and large challenges that came with sharing a life. On their anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by friends who had known them since youth and others acquired along the way, they stood once more before a minister and spoke vows that had only deepened in meaning over the decades. Evander's hand shook slightly as he held hers, whether from age or emotion she couldn't tell, but his voice was strong and clear as he promised to love her for whatever time remained to them. And when it was her turn, when she looked into those grey-green eyes that had first captured her heart more than half a century ago, Ameline spoke from the deepest part of her soul. "You taught me how to live," she said, abandoning the formal vows they had planned in favor of simple truth. "You taught me that love isn't something to be feared, but something to be celebrated, that vulnerability is strength, that taking risks is how we truly engage with life. Everything I am, everything I've become, is because you loved me enough to fight for us when I was too frightened to fight for myself. And I will love you, Evander Blackwood, until my last breath and beyond, for you are not just my husband, but my best friend, my partner, my home." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, and when they kissed it was to applause and cheers, and the certain knowledge that what they had was rare and beautiful, the kind of love that inspired others to believe that such things were possible, that fairy tales could come true if you were brave enough to reach for them. The party that followed was joyous, full of dancing and laughter, and stories told and retold about the couple who had loved so deeply for so long. Their grandchildren performed a play they had written about their grandparents' love story, dramatizing in charmingly exaggerated fashion the tale of the winter ball reunion that had changed everything. And late in the evening, when most of the guests had departed and only close family remained, they all gathered in the rose garden for a final toast under the stars. Eleanor, now a grandmother herself, raised her glass and spoke for all of them. "To love that endures," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "To courage in the face of fear, to second chances, to parents who taught us by example what it means to truly commit to another person. May we all be so blessed." Standing there surrounded by the fruits of their love, children and grandchildren, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone, Ameline felt a peace so profound it seemed to emanate from her very core. They had done it. They had taken a love that began in youth and impulsive passion and transformed it into something mature and lasting, something that had not just survived but flourished over 5 decades of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. As the evening wound down and they finally found themselves alone in their rooms, exhausted but happy, Evander pulled Ameline into his arms with the easy familiarity of long practice. "Thank you," he said softly. For what? She asked, echoing her question from years before. For saying yes, for taking the risk, for giving us all of this. He gestured vaguely, encompassing not just the room, but everything, their life together, their family, the love that had sustained them through everything. She smiled and reached up to cup his face, feeling the familiar contours, the beloved features marked by time, but no less dear. The pleasure, she said, has been entirely mine. They lived several more years after that milestone, years full of simple pleasures and quiet contentment, watching their great-grandchildren grow, tending their gardens, enjoying the peace that came from having lived fully and loved deeply. They were still together, still choosing each other every day when Evander passed quietly one autumn morning, simply failing to wake from sleep, his expression peaceful as if he were having a pleasant dream. The grief that consumed Ameline was crushing, the loss of her other half leaving her feeling incomplete, in a way she hadn't experienced since before their reunion. But even in her sorrow, she recognized that this pain was the price of love, that you couldn't love someone as deeply as she had loved Evander without being devastated by their loss. And she wouldn't have traded a single moment of their time together to avoid this pain, wouldn't have loved him any less to protect herself from this grief. She lived 2 more years after his death, years in which she honored his memory by continuing to engage with life as she had promised. She spent time with her family, maintained the gardens they had created together, and worked on a memoir that told their story, not just the dramatic reunion, but the decades that followed, the ordinary days that had been just as important as the extraordinary ones. And on a spring morning very much like the one on which they had married, with the roses blooming and the sun streaming through her window, Ameline closed her eyes for the last time and went to wherever Evander had gone before her. Those who found her said she looked peaceful, almost happy, and clasped in her hand was the sapphire engagement ring Evander had given her more than 50 years earlier, still as brilliant as the day he had first slipped it onto her finger. Their children buried them side by side in the chapel where they had married, beneath a stone that read simply, Evander and Ameline Blackwood, they chose love. And though their physical presence was gone, their legacy lived on in the children and grandchildren, who carried forward their lessons about courage and vulnerability and the transformative power of choosing to love deeply despite the risks. Years later, on winter evenings when the family gathered at Ashmore House, someone would invariably tell the story of the winter ball, of the Duke who came back after 5 years and the lady who found the courage to try again. And younger generations would listen with wide eyes, romanticizing the drama of it, imagining themselves in similar circumstances. But the older ones, those who had known Evander and Ameline personally, who had witnessed their daily love rather than just the dramatic moments, knew the real story. They knew that the winter ball was just the beginning, that the real love story was in the 52 years that followed, in the countless small choices to be kind when it would be easier to be cruel, to communicate when it would be simpler to retreat, to keep choosing each other day after day after day. That was the legacy Evander and Ameline left behind, not just a romantic story of lost love found again, but a practical blueprint for how to sustain love over a lifetime, how to grow together rather than apart, how to be brave enough to be vulnerable and wise enough to appreciate what you have while you have it. And so their story ended, not with the dramatic reunion, but with decades of quiet devotion, not with passionate declarations, but with the deep contentment of 2 people who had found in each other everything they needed. It ended with the certain knowledge that they had lived fully, loved deeply, and created something beautiful that would echo through generations. For those who knew them, who had witnessed their love firsthand, the lesson was clear, that fear might be natural, but courage was necessary, that vulnerability was strength rather than weakness, that the greatest risk in life wasn't loving too much, but loving too little, that a life lived in careful protection was no life at all, but merely an existence, and that when you found real love, true love, the kind that saw you completely and loved you anyway, you fought for it, you nurtured it, you chose it again and again, no matter how frightening that choice might be. That was the true legacy of Lady Ameline Lockridge and Duke Evander Blackwood. Not just that they had loved, but how they had loved, with courage and persistence, and a willingness to risk everything for something that mattered more than safety, more than pride, more than fear. And for anyone who ever stood at that same crossroads, choosing between protection and possibility, between safety and risk, between existing and truly living, their story served as a reminder that the only choice that ever really mattered was the choice to be brave, the choice to trust, the choice to love. Dear friends, thank you for joining us on this journey through Emmeline and Evander's enduring love story. Their tale reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, that courage can triumph over fear, and that true love is worth every risk we take for it. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, we would be so grateful if you would subscribe to our Echoes of Romance channel for more beautiful love stories that will transport you to other times and places. Please leave a comment below telling us what you loved most about Emmeline and Evander's journey. We truly cherish hearing from each of you. And don't forget to click that like button and activate your notifications so you never miss a new story from us. Until next time, may you always choose love over fear, and may you find the courage to write your own beautiful love story. With all our affection, Echoes of Romance.